Fish Scale Fleet. The year is 1044 AD. You are a Song Dynasty naval commander standing at the prow of a warship on the Yangtze River, and your fleet behind you doesn't look like a fleet. It looks alive. Row after row of vessels stagger in overlapping arcs, each one offset from the next by a precise angular degree, the whole formation breathing and shifting as a single organism. It is not a metaphor. It is engineering. The Wujing Zongyao, the great imperial military encyclopedia completed under Zheng Gongliang in 1044 AD, doesn't just name this arrangement the Yupinzhen, the fish scale array. It specifies the geometry. It prescribes the offset angle between vessel rows. It instructs commanders to compress or expand the formation based on river width and current speed. Some researchers studying the prescribed angles have noted that the specified offset bears a striking resemblance to the optimal wake drafting position, the same principle used by migrating birds in a V formation and competitive cyclists in a peloton, though no peer-reviewed study has formally confirmed this correspondence. Hydrodynamics as a formal science would not emerge in the West until the 18th century, roughly 700 years later. Mainstream historians argue the stagger simply maximized crossbow fire arcs, preventing vessels in the same row from blocking each other's line of sight. But the Wujing Zongyao doesn't describe it in terms of sight lines. It describes it in terms of the water. Who taught them to watch the fish? Double Dragon Sweep. It is November of 1161 AD, and the Jin dynasty has sent a fleet of 600 warships down the Yangtze to annihilate the southern Song navy. The Song commander, Yu Yunwen, has 70 vessels. He doesn't retreat. He divides his fleet in half. One column goes left, one goes right. They sail away from each other until the far bank swallows the other column entirely from view. And then, at a pre-agreed moment with no signal, no flag, no drum that could carry across that distance, both columns turn. They sweep around opposite flanks of the Jin fleet and collide behind it, sealing it inside a closing fist. Yu Yunwen destroys 600 ships with 70. The Battle of Kaishi is recorded in the Song Imperial Histories, and the formation is analyzed in Zheng Ruozheng's Chouhai Tubian of 1562 as a textbook execution of the double dragon sweep. The coordination problem at its center remains a subject of debate among historians, who have proposed various solutions without reaching consensus. The two columns were operating blind across more than 1 kilometer of open water. There were no synchronized timepieces in 1161 AD, no signal rockets, no radio, yet both columns turned and converged behind the enemy with sufficient precision to complete the encirclement before any Jin vessel could break free. The timing was pre-calculated on land and then executed on pure internal count, supposedly using water clock synchronization, a clepsydra, to align the two columns before separation. Some researchers have asked whether this implies a mathematical model of angular convergence that predates Western formal geometry by centuries. We may never know. But Yu Yunwen knew. Circle of spears. Picture a wheel of warships, not anchored, rotating, every vessel moving continuously around a central point, bows aimed outward, crossbowmen firing in sequence so that no matter what direction an enemy approaches from, a loaded weapon is always pointing at them. Now hold that image and consider what it actually requires. The arc of fire for each ship's crossbowman must cover the gap left by the ship ahead, while ending precisely before it reaches the ship behind. As the circle rotates, those arcs shift continuously. The angular mathematics required to set the initial spacing, the rotation speed, and the fire arc so that no friendly vessel ever enters the danger zone at any point in the rotation is equivalent to a problem in differential angular geometry, a branch of mathematics not formally developed in Europe until the 17th century. Song Dynasty coastal defense records from Fujian province describe this formation, the Huanjijin, the encircling strike array, with specific vessel spacing ratios of approximately 1.5 ship lengths between each vessel in the ring. The rotation direction is prescribed as always clockwise when facing the prevailing wind, suggesting the formation was calibrated to wind-assisted rotation speed, not arbitrary preference. The prescribed spacing, when modeled geometrically, suggests that a zero friendly fire overlap may have been achievable at the documented rotation speed, though this has not been confirmed by an independently verified published study. Mainstream historians describe the circle as primarily psychological, a continuously moving target difficult to assault. But the source texts don't describe it in psychological terms. They give numbers, and the numbers work. 5. 8 trigrams array. In 1561, A.D., a Ming Dynasty general named Qi Jiguang published a military manual that should not function as a military manual. The Jixiao Xinshu, his new treatise on military efficiency, maps each section of his naval formation directly onto one of the 8 trigrams of the Harqing, the cosmological system encoding the fundamental forces of the universe that had existed for more than 2,500 years before Qi Jiguang was born. This is not symbolic decoration. The trigram Gen, governing thunder and movement, commands the fast attack flanking vessels. The trigram Gen, governing the mountain and stillness, governs the anchored artillery barges. The metaphysical properties of each trigram directly determine the tactical behavior of each fleet section. Qi Jiguang used variants of this formation in his campaigns against Wokou pirates along the Zhejiang coast between 1555 and 1567, achieving a record of battlefield success that later accounts, some hagiographic in nature, summarized as an unbroken string of victories. The I Ching framing, historians argue, was motivational and organizational, giving each unit a memorable symbolic identity in a culture where cosmological symbolism carried deep psychological weight. But the formation's tactical geometry doesn't need the I Ching to function. Qi Jiguang could have numbered his units. He chose the trigrams specifically, and he documented his reason. The properties of each trigram describe the behavioral logic of that unit's role. A 3,000-year-old metaphysical text produced operationally valid naval formations without modification. The question some researchers have quietly asked is whether the I Ching was ever only a philosophical document or whether it encoded something else entirely. Crescent Moon Armada. The year is 1561 A.D. General Qi Jiguang is watching a Wokou pirate fleet approach his position off the coast of Zhejiang province. He has fewer ships. He does not close the distance. Instead, his fleet curves, bowing inward like a crescent moon laid on its back, the 2 horns of the formation extending forward on either side of the enemy's approach vector. The pirates sail between the horns close. There is no exit. The Chuhai Tubian, compiled by Zheng Ruozheng just 1 year after these engagements, diagrams the crescent moon armada and specifies the horn extension angle at approximately 30 degrees from the central axis. When modern pursuit curve mathematics, a field formerly solved by the French mathematician Pierre Boguet in 1732, identifies the optimal closing angle for a concave envelopment, it arrives at a figure strikingly close to that same 30 degrees. Qi Jiguang solved it operationally in the field 170 years earlier. What makes this stranger is that the crescent formation is not uniquely Chinese. The Ottoman Navy used an almost identical concave array called the Hilal at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, 10 years after Qi Jiguang's documented use, with no evidence of transmission between them. The ancient Greek navy at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC adopted a formation that some historians interpret as a deliberate concave envelopment, though classicists continue to debate whether the shape was a calculated strategy or a consequence of the strait's geography. Naval historian Geoffrey Till, in his work on sea power, has observed that envelopment tactics recur across naval history in cultures with no evident contact, suggesting the concave closing maneuver may be a near-universal response to the geometry of sea combat. Intuition doesn't produce the same angle twice. What does? Turtle shell defense. There is a formation with no front, no flank, no rear. Every direction equally armed, equally shielded, equally lethal. An enemy fleet circles it looking for the weak point and finds nothing because every point in a circle is equidistant from the center, and whoever designed this understood that geometry is not a metaphor. It is a weapon. The Huolongjing, the fire dragon manual compiled in the mid-14th century and attributed to Zhao Yu and Liu Ji, describes the turtle shell defense as a closed circular fleet arrangement for protecting gunpowder weapon carriers at the formation's center. The outer ring vessel count is specified as 24, a number divisible into the 360 degrees of a full circle at exactly 15-degree intervals, matching precisely the angular offset prescribed in the fish scale fleet nearly 300 years earlier. The Huolongjing also specifies that vessels cycle from the outer to the inner ring in a rotation timed to complete one full exchange every quarter hour, measured by incense stick timing. The Korean Jeobuksun, Admiral Yi Sun-sin's famous turtle ship developed in 1592, uses an identical closed-perimeter defensive philosophy with no documented Chinese influence on its design. Mainstream historians argue the circular shape is the natural result of wanting equal coverage in all directions. But wanting equal coverage and achieving it mathematically are separated by calculation. Some researchers have also noted that the prescribed count of 24 echoes the 24 solar terms of the Chinese astronomical calendar. Was naval geometry being derived from the same mathematical tradition that divided the sky? Flying Serpent Line. Around the year 1400 AD, somewhere in the South China Sea, the treasure fleet of Zheng He was, according to Chinese imperial records, the largest naval expedition in pre-modern human history, with traditional accounts citing 317 ships and approximately 27,000 men. Some Western historians dispute these figures as significant overestimates, but even conservative reconstructions place the fleet far beyond any European naval force of the era. When hostile forces approached, the fleet didn't form a wall. It formed a line that moved like a river, curving and undulating, each ship firing at a different moment in a sequence that created a rolling wave of projectiles advancing toward the target. The Chohai Tubian describes this sequence in terms that are technically staggering. The delay between each vessel's firing is not fixed. It is variable, adjusted by the lead commander reading a standardized wind force scale and communicating the variable to each captain in the line. The pattern this produces is effectively unpredictable to the target. The mathematical concept underlying it is pseudo-random sequence generation, a principle in information theory not formally developed until the 20th century. The source text calls it, in one surviving phrase, fire that follows the wind's arithmetic, an account sometimes associated with Zheng, whose operations against the pirate Chen Zuyi describes enemy vessels being struck in a rolling sequence, though historians place that engagement during the first voyage around 1407, when Chen Zuyi was captured and later executed. The 1416 date in some secondary sources appears to be a transmission error in the historical record. Mainstream historians attribute the staggered firing to practical necessity, preventing all ships from reloading simultaneously. But practical necessity doesn't require a wind force formula. You do not write a formula for an accident. What were they calculating, and from what theoretical base? Diamond point strike. There is a shape that appears in military history on every continent, in every era, across cultures that never met. A wedge, a spear tip. A V aimed at the enemy's center. Alexander the Great used it at Gaugamela in 331 BC. The Vikings used it. The Zulus used it. But only one culture wrote down exactly why it works in the language of the water. The Wujing Zongyao of 1044 AD describes the Huanzhen, the cone or awl formation, and specifies that the leading vessel should be the heaviest and most reinforced in the fleet. Not because it will absorb the most enemy fire, because a heavier bow creates a larger pressure displacement wave, providing a draft relief channel for the vessels immediately behind it. The text then specifies that the secondary vessels should be positioned not directly behind the leader, but at an offset, receiving, in its own phrase, the water's gift. That offset, prescribed as approximately 1/6 of a right angle, comes within 4 degrees of the mathematically derived Kelvin-Wake angle, the optimal following position in a ship's bow wave, formally described by Lord Kelvin in 1887, more than 800 years after the Wujing Zongyao was compiled. Scholars working in the tradition of Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China have pointed to this passage as one of the earliest known written descriptions of applied fluid resistance in a military context, though this specific characterization should be verified against the relevant volumes before it is treated as a direct Needham citation. Mainstream historians read the heavy leading vessel as a battering ram, but a battering ram explanation cannot account for the phrase, the water's gift. That is not a description of collision. That is a description of hydrodynamic force. Wave breaker. Array. There are places on the Yangtze River where the water does not behave like water. In the Kutang Gorge, the river compresses between cliff walls barely 100 meters apart, and the current accelerates during spring flood season to speeds approaching 8 meters per second, fast enough to render oared vessels completely unable to maneuver against the flow. In the 12th century, southern Song commanders defending the Sichuan gorges against Jin Dynasty incursions developed a formation that did not fight the current. It read it, the wave breaker. Array, referenced in Song military records and the Song Huiyao Jigao, positioned specific vessel classes at specific points in the gorge's current based on a detailed, named cartography of localized hydrological behavior, including the positions of standing waves, hydraulic jumps, and backflow eddies that form at specific water levels. The lightest, most maneuverable vessels were assigned to eddy zones behind river bends, positions where backflow current would hold them in place with minimal effort, effectively granting them free tactical positioning that heavier Jin vessels could not replicate. Research into Yangtze River historical navigation records has identified the gorge's standing waves, hydraulic jumps, and backflow eddies as stable, mappable features that persist across centuries, suggesting the formation's anchor positions were based on real and repeatable hydrological knowledge rather than improvisation. Mainstream historians describe this as experienced seamanship encoded through practice. But experienced seamanship stays in sailors' heads. The wave breaker. Array was written down, formalized, and prescriptive enough to be taught to commanders who had never seen the gorge. That is a scientific document, and it predates formal Western River hydrological survey by roughly 6 centuries. Encircling net fleet. In 1562 AD, military strategist Zheng Rozeng published a diagram in the Chohai Tubian that a modern topologist would recognize immediately. It is a nested set of vessel rings, each ring serving a different function, connected by radial corridors of smaller ships. The outer ring catches, the middle ring contains, the inner ring kills. The corridors allow controlled movement between rings. It is not described as resembling a net. Jing Ruosing states explicitly that he derived the formation from observing professional ocean fishermen working in coordinated net teams off the Zhejiang coast. The net is not the metaphor. The net is the source code. What makes this remarkable is what a fishing net actually is in formal mathematical terms. A net is a planar graph in which every open space is surrounded by a cycle, and the removal of any single edge does not disconnect the structure. These properties, connectivity, cycle redundancy, and fault tolerance, are the foundations of graph theory, formally established by Leonhard Euler in 1736 with his solution to the Königsberg Bridge problem. The encircling net fleet diagram, published 174 years before Euler was born, is a physical instantiation of a fault-tolerant planar graph. The Chohai Tubian describes the property explicitly in its own language. When one fish is taken from the net does not fall. If any vessel is destroyed, the formation redistributes automatically without collapsing. Mainstream historians describe this as practical multi-layered defense. But Zheng Ruosing didn't learn it from military theory. He learned it from fishermen. The question that remains is how long the fishermen had known. 10 formations. 10 solutions encoded in manuals, in diagrams, in the language of astronomers, cosmologists, and men who spent their lives reading rivers. The mainstream explanation is empirical genius, centuries of trial and error on actual water-producing practical results that happen to mirror formal mathematics developed centuries later in Europe. And perhaps that's exactly right. But the precision is too consistent. The fish scale offset matches modern wake drafting calculations. The crescent angle echoes the pursuit curve. The turtle shell count mirrors the astronomical calendar. The net topology anticipates graph theory. These formations feel less like independent discoveries and more like fragments of a unified framework, a deep theory of movement, geometry, and force that someone somewhere understood completely. Most people encounter these texts as dusty military history and move on. You watch this far, that means you're reading them as something else. Go to the comments and tell me which formation you think contains the real smoking gun, the number or phrase that no coincidence can explain. Make your case. Subscribe if you want to keep digging. The fish knew how to move in formation long before we did. The net held together without breaking long before we proved why. Every ancient formation is a question the water asked and a civilization that answered.